Welcome everybody to this second last public seminar of this term. My name is Manuel Eisner. For those of you who have never been here at this seminar series, I'm the director of the Institute and have the great pleasure of introducing the speakers of tonight, namely Professor Katrin Hohl from the City University of London, and Lanskey, who will be acting as the discussant and coordinator of questions from the audience from the Institute of Criminology. Just a few words on the way we would like to run this seminar. If I can move this forward, let's just see. First of all, I just wanted to remind those of you, who have not been here before, that this is part of a series of seminars around the topic of innovations in criminal justice policies. We designed this series after the elections this year, where we thought it would be interesting and important for the Institute to learn more about the various policies and policy agendas that the new government has set up, and try to have a conversation around these policies and whether they may be successful or whether they may not be successful. I'm not going to go through the details here. I just wanted to add that next week, I know that some of you get some essay questions tomorrow. But if you can still free some time, that would be fantastic, because it will be a little bit outside the usual topics. It will be a talk about environmental criminology and transnational environmental crime, which was not actually on the agenda of the new government, or not as a priority on the agenda, but it's very interesting. It's going to be a very interesting talk as well. With respect to discussion questions, what we'll try to do again is that the audience, also those of you who are joining us online, I saw that quite a large number of people are joining online, could ask questions via slide. The way this works is that probably best thing that you can do is just scan the QR code now with your mobile phone. You can ask, or you write down the number somewhere, because it's not going to be shown again. It takes you to a page where you can just either takes you directly to the page, or you type in the code number, and you can enter a question of up to 160 characters. Instead of asking a question, you can also like a question that has already been asked, so that will help us to prioritize. And I will then pass on the question to Caroline, and Caroline will then engage in the conversation with Katrin. So that's the way we do this as a preference. But if somebody really insists on asking a question in person, we will admit also question in person if really necessary. But the experience is that it works better if you ask questions online. Just very briefly, I would like to introduce Katrin Hohl, and it's really amazing. It's a great pleasure to have you here. She started as a lecturer in 2012 at the university, at City University, after she completed a PhD. So I'm going to do a little bit of propaganda for her career and the way she's thinking, with a PhD on research methods. And so this, what this shows you is that really doing a PhD on social science research methods is something really interesting at LSE. She comes from a business administration background, originally from southern Germany. And currently she is really focusing on two areas of research. The first is on how the police responds to sexual violence and domestic abuse, and what can be done to improve policing responses to sexual violence and domestic abuse. And the second strand of research centers around public trust in the police legitimacy, and the implication of procedural justice theory to police interactions with victims of domestic abuse. What I just would like to outline with a few words is the kind of policy impact activities that Katrin is involved in, because that fits so nicely into the goals of the series. And it's also, I thought it would also be inspiring to our MPhil, PhD undergraduate student audience today to hear something about the kind of things, just very briefly about the kind of things that she's doing. She has been awarded, and I want to start there this year, an OBE for her work on services to victims of sexual violence. And that's quite an extraordinary achievement. I just wanted to point this out because that's really showing a recognition of the policy impact that she's been having with her research. She's also inaugural Lord Mayor's fellow, and I needed to look up what this means. And I just wanted to briefly outline what this means. So the City of London, which is a small bit of the entire London, the old City of London, the medieval City of London, has created this role to, kind of, if I understand it right, to promote policy agendas that are dear to the City of London. And so in this role, Katrin is working with the City of London to address issues relating to violence against women and girls, which has been made a priority of the incoming Lord Mayor of London. In this role, she conducts research, but she's also engaged in dissemination and engagement activities. She's also an independent advisor to the UK government on criminal justice responses to sexual violence. She also is an expert advisor to the International Criminal Court and a member of a number of advisory groups. But I just wanted to finish with an academic project that she's involved in, and I assume you will be talking about it, Operation Soteria Bluestone, which she's been doing together with Professor Betsy Stanko, which is a research program that aims to improve procedural justice and outcome justice for rape and other sexual offences. And so she's combined theory and research to develop a model, the National Operating Model, it's called, for the police when investigating rape and serious sexual violence cases, and something that is now being implemented across the UK. And so I will finish here, but just, I think this is as something to think about as a possible ways in which criminological research can actually have an impact on policy making. This is an absolutely outstanding example, so it's a great privilege to have you here and listen to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for being here today.
Hang on, I just need to.
Well, it's my slides. Him having pointed out the squiggly line of my career at a first degree, I did absolutely nothing with, to a degree, which was 2 degrees at the LSE around research methods and statistics, to now criminology. I should probably preface this talk by saying, while my background is very much in methods, and I think methods is incredibly central to the questions we asked and the answers we might be able to get, is today's talks is much more about ideas. So these are ideas that come out of theory, where there has been research, but I'll be light on empirical findings today, and more want to share with you ideas about theory and about practice. So, as Manuel mentioned, the invitation for this talk is to address one of the topics that the new government has considered a priority, and that is violence against women and girls. Now, the government has a mission they call a Safer Streets mission, and within that, they've pledged to halve violence against women and girls within a decade. Now, for anyone who even has the slightest background in violence against women and girls, so for anyone who's got even just a cursory understanding of violence against women and girls, it being subsumed under Safer Streets is jarring, because we know that Only a very small amount of violence against women and girls takes place in streets and public spaces. And 90% of sexual violence is committed by someone known to the victim. They can name them, they probably have their contact numbers, it's probably their partner, a family member, it's behind those closed doors. And the feminist literature on sexual violence has spent the last 40 years trying to correct this myth of the stranger danger rape and considers this as harmful to our ability to understand and therefore address sexual violence, the fact that we consider safer spaces, safer streets as the mission. And the reason I'm pointing this out is not for the sake of criticising government, it's because it will become relevant again when we talk about the police, what the mission of the police is, what police is designed to do and not to do. So safer streets and violence against women and girls, there is only a very small overlap. Before we go further, violence against women and girls, the things we typically subsume under that is sexual offending, domestic abuse, stalking, harassment, so-called honor-based violence, female genital mutilation, forced marriages, a wide range of things. The big two in terms of volume is domestic abuse and sexual offending. In today's talk, I will focus on sexual offending only. And I'll further narrow it onto the contribution of the police or what the police might possibly be able to do to help achieve this very ambitious goal of halving violence against women and girls. This, of course, sidelines a huge area of criminology, including one that this institute has contributed much to, which is prevention and intervention that sits outside of the justice system. But today, the focus is sexual violence. What can the police do as part of it? And I'll draw on some of the findings, but also the theoretical framework behind something called Operation Soteria Bluestone, and this book, which I'm shamelessly flogging, but it is free as an ebook, so I make no money out of flogging it. It came out this year. So I'm drawing on ideas in this book. Right. With the disclaimers out of the way, the eagle-eyed amongst you would have said half violence against women and girls. Your immediate question is, what is this figure we are going to halve? The government has not yet given an answer to what that figure is. Given I've said I will focus on the police, it feels legit to start with what's on the books of the police. What's the sexual violence police have on their books? This is a timeline of the last 20 years based on official data. It's not called national statistics because the quality of police recorded data is so bad that it had that label removed 10 years ago and it hasn't improved data quality sufficiently to have it back. But this is what's on policing's books. So what we can see here is rape, the lower line, which stands at about nearly 70,000 rapes recorded in the last year on record, which is the year that finished in March 24, and then other sexual offences, which stand at about 120,000. Now, is this a measure of the sexual violence that we see in England and Wales? It isn't, because we need to look at all the elements that make the so-called data generating process. So one is, of course, the sexual violence that happens out there. Of that, we think between 40 and 20% get reported to police, so not all of it gets reported to the police. And then further, not everything that's reported gets recorded. That was a particular problem, especially 10 years ago, when research showed that police were declaring or things are no crime, so deleting it from the record, saying it didn't actually take place, even though there was no evidence to suggest it didn't take place. That has been fixed largely, but the fix has so often created new problems. So we know that even today, police are often misrecording, under-recording, and now sometimes over-recording what is there. So this we can't take as the figure of what's going on in society, but it's an important figure nonetheless, because this is the part of the sexual violence police come to know about, and where arguably we can say police should have a duty to respond to it in one way or another. This is what's within policing's sight. So if we said we wanted to make the task for police, now I've gone completely off, no, I'm back. We wouldn't expect that the police can solve sexual violence out there that hasn't yet taken place and nobody told them about, but just focus on the sexual violence you've been told about. This would be it. So that's the starting point. Now, not all of it is reported by the victim survivors themselves. Some is reported by someone else, but the vast majority probably does come through victim survivors. The question is, why? Why do you report it to the police? What do you want out of it? There's the question of why, the trigger, what prompted the telling police at that point in time. But the question I want to direct to is not what prompted it, but what would have been a good outcome for you. So this is from a survey I've been running for the last 1.5 years, which had a total of over 5,000 victim survivors complete a survey about their experience of reporting a rape or a sexual assault to the police in England and Wales. This is data from a report that came out last week, which covers the last 12 months of data. So here we asked, what would be if the survivor told us they're still in the process, or would have been if they're telling us their case is concluded, been a good outcome for you if the police coming to know about your case? Overwhelmingly, it's to stop the perpetrator from doing it again. 88% said it was extremely important. If you add to those who say very important, you're getting to nearly 95% of survivors. It's an almost universal ask. It's prevention, reduction of sexual violence. I don't want it to happen again, to me or someone else. That's near universal reason for reporting. The very interesting one to me is of all the reasons we put out there, the perpetrator understanding what they did was wrong, to feel safer, to feel you can put behind you, some validation that what happened was criminal and wrong, all the reasons we know from the literature. The one that ranks least is the perpetrator being convicted. That is very interesting to me, because that means that to some victim survivors, the police isn't merely a gateway to get to retribution and punishment in the criminal justice system. It's something else. There's something else in there. And stopping perpetrators mightn't necessarily equate with a trial and a conviction. So there is a really clear mandate from victims here to say, I'm telling you about what happened to me because I want this to not happen to someone else. So, and that, you could in this point argue that what the government is proposing to do very much aligns with what victim survivors expect the police to do. Now, in reality, we know that the rape charge rate, 3 years ago when we started Operation Soteria, it was only 1.3% of rapes reported that year got charged that year, and it ticks up with the delays to about 2%, very low. The vast majority don't get a prosecution. The survey further showed that only in 1/3 of cases, victims said they know that police took steps to protect them from perpetrators. So little there. These are some of the free text responses from survivors about how tremendously impactful it is to them when this doesn't appear to take place and they find out about it. So I always think if they tried harder with me, it wouldn't have happened to her. If they might have taken my case seriously, he might have stopped. So there's a huge damage, harmful impact on victims from seeing they've made this report and police didn't use it, didn't appear to try and use their report to stop the perpetrator doing it again. Another little glimpse from, to, I suppose, underline the importance of the police on this, whatever we end up at the end of this talk to discuss and conclude about whether police can actually reduce sexual violence. What police do matters because it matters to those we come in contact with. We asked victims in the survey, as a result of what the police did or didn't do in your case, have the following increased, decreased, or improved, stayed the same, or gotten worse. 3 in 4 say their mental health is worse as a direct result of what police did and didn't do. 40% say they actually feel less safe as a result of what police do. Not just no change, but less safe as a result of that. This shows you how important it is what police do, regardless of whether they achieve the stopping of perpetrators. And we've just seen there are 160,000, if we combine rape and other sexual offences, on the books this year alone. That's not an insignificant number of victim survivors behind this. And I haven't yet even started to speak about the perpetrators. Now, are victim survivors mad or deluded in expecting that the police would try and use their report to stop perpetrators? Is this beyond what we might expect should happen? Now, the police have had a mission statement long before companies had them. The first Peelian principle. So Peel founded the Metropolitan Police in 1829, and the basic principles of policing are attributed to him. We now know he never wrote these, they were written decades later by someone else, but we call them Peelian principles. And police refer to these often. And the first one, not one of them, the first one is the basic mission of the police is they exist to prevent crime and disorder. Jackpot, the government, victims, and the police all align. Now, why is it that the reality doesn't look like the mission? What's going on here? Or is something going on? And I would argue that actually things aren't going wrong. Things are going exactly how policing was designed. It just was never designed with women or the crimes that disproportionately affect women in mind. So, and I'll only go through a couple of these points. There are more in here, is what policing was designed to do and what it was never designed to do, and the consequences that has if we apply that model to now ask the police to investigate rape and serious sexual offences preventive to all of those missions. So police forces as we know it, policing has been around for much longer as organisations, but they really took off at the time of the industrialisation and urbanisation, and there are different readings of the history of police forces. One of them is that urbanisation has created new problems of crime and disorder that needed to be addressed. The focus was on public spaces. The focus was on sanitising public spaces. Another one is that capitalism and the sort of that setup has created problems for the elite. They wanted to be solved by a police force. Another would be the reading that as societies over time, we've tried to sanitize society from physical violence. So you give police the monopoly on the legitimate use of force versus powers, and that's their job. So that's all of that sits in there. Now, when they were set up, some of the default modes of what police do is, the first one is law enforcement was never the aim. It was quelling disorder, it was public order is the aim. And in fact, law enforcement is not just only one of the tools, it's actually disincentivized. Because the other aspect of British or English policing is the idea of policing by consent. If you use violence, state violence, if you use force or your legal powers to get what you want, this will not help you to legitimize you as an authority, as a legitimate holder of authority and power in society. Ironically, the less police resort to their unique powers and the use of force, the more likely we perceive police to be legitimate. There's a huge literature around this, it's called procedural justice theory. So it's actually disincentivized for police to do that. Police will look more legitimate and their authority is more affirmed if they can resolve the situation simply by authority. So one example would be, say, there is a fight breaking out at the end of the night. Police could choose to use violence to separate people, to arrest them, to prosecute them. That is one option. Another option is to talk the two parties down and make them go home separately. The second option is much preferable because it was their authority and their authority that's blown that resolved it, with the threat or the possibility that they might use their coercive powers, but they didn't. The other one is that the number of crimes committed far outstrips police capacity. It was never possible to enforce every crime. We do not have enough officers, we do not have enough courts, we do not have enough prison spaces. It is a physical impossibility. It always was. It was never meant to happen, it couldn't happen, and it's not in the interest of police to happen because of the way policing by consent works. And I realise I didn't explain that idea very well, but this is an interesting one to look at. The focus is on public spaces. The focus is on reactive policing, not prevention, resolving those issues. None of this is set up for the way sexual violence most of the time works. Most of it happens behind closed doors. It doesn't create disorder in public spaces. It isn't the issue of the people who designed the forces, the people who sat round a table were white elite men. Women weren't at the table and women weren't considered in this. Rape and marriage only became illegal in 1992, so wouldn't even be in scope. It was considered completely normal for a husband to physically reprimand his wife and his children. It wasn't something he'd get involved in. How we see rape and sexual violence was 22-3. It started off as a property crime committed against the dad because that daughter was now worth less. So wasn't in focus, and it doesn't work because the nature of sexual offending works differently. For example, most of it isn't reported immediately. There isn't a wider danger to the wider public in the eyes of police because it's interpersonal, it's playing on existing relationships. It's not naturally what police is designed to do. Now, you could argue that this doesn't matter today. This is what police was then. Policing now is wholly different. What has changed is public awareness of sexual violence, whether that's Me Too, Sarah Everard, or now Gisèle Picolet. All of those things point to a much bigger awareness of sexual violence and a different expectation. There's also a much different expectation of sexual violence in the context of intimate partner relationships, accounting for about a third of what's reported to police. And there clearly is a change in officer rhetoric. So you will hear senior officers constantly repeat, violence against women is a priority. We take every report seriously. We will investigate every case, which we now know is pretty impossible to do. And since last year, and some of you might think that's maybe late, but since last year, violence against women and girls has become a strategic policing requirement. Those are set by Home Secretaries, and they require policing to work together and make plans locally and nationally for things that are considered national threats, so typically things like terrorism. And they say violence against women and girls is similarly a national threat, so you all have to produce an assessment of what that threat is, and you have to make plans and you have to allocate resources. Now, my point is that simply declaring something a priority but feeding it through the same system that hasn't been adjusted to deal with the nature of that crime will not succeed. Simply declaring something a priority doesn't change. My other point would be that over the last 3 decades, there has been a huge amount of research. There has been government report after government report finding the same problems within policing and making the same recommendations. So an interesting exercise is to put side by side the reports written in the 90s and the 2000s and by, say, Louise Casey a couple of years ago. And as a sort of nerdy game of bingo, named a decade, I bet you would find it difficult to distinguish between them because the recommendations have largely stayed the same. But there hasn't been improvement in policing. If anything, it's gone down. So charge rates started to drop in 2016 up until 2021. So they didn't go up, they went down, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms as well. So it's a point of frustration that nothing was changing, nothing was working. And it's from that point of frustration that Betsy Stanko and I began writing this book, but also developed the ideas, and she was instrumental in getting it going, set up Operation Soteria Bluestone. So this started in 2021 as a small pilot in one police force called Project Bluestone, and the police chose that name, which sounds policey, and Operation Soteria. Soteria was picked by the then Prime Minister, who had an affinity for all things Greek. She's the goddess of protection. So we ended up with this name for the project. So the starting point of this project was utter frustration. How can charge rates be so low? How can victim experiences be so bad? How are we in a situation that for the vast majority of victims, they feel worse off having involved the police than they, or say they feel worse off than they did before? So we set about developing a theoretical framework that drew on all that we already know, and then used very comprehensive empirical research, looking at police case files, interviews, observations, watching their body-worn videos, looking at all of their internal policies, looking at their training, looking at their data, looking at every aspect of what they were doing to map the as-is, and then to work very closely with policing to develop solutions. So what was clear was the recommendations, when you look at them, they're very sensible, they're typically rooted in evidence, but it's also clear that police couldn't turn recommendations into action. So one of the rules we had in the project was no recommendations. There could only be solutions. None of us was allowed to make recommendations. So over 55 academics were in our project, solutions only. We as academics are absolutely terrible at solutions because you can't develop a solution for practice unless you're really rooted in it. So we work closely with policing to share the emerging findings and to say, well, what do you think? How could it change? So we work together to turn research, so it's powered by research, but not academia for academia's sake or to further theory necessarily, although maybe it has in the process, but theory in the service of practice. So we did a small pilot, then we got about 2.5 million for 1 year of research, then similar for another year of research. And 2 years on, in 2023, we had developed what was then called, or is now called, the National Operating Model for Rape and Serious Sexual Offence Investigation. This is the first ever of this nature. And it's most certainly the first not written by policing for policing, but written by academics with officers, that sets out how to investigate, how to disrupt perpetrators, how to engage with victims, and provides sort of an actionable toolkit, but also various strategic documents. Last year, that was made mandatory for all police forces. The Home Secretary ordered a HMIC inspection into progress of the police against it, which was published this summer. And there is now a joint secretariat unit, it's called Staff, between the National Police Chiefs Council and the Home Office that supports forces nationally in the implementation. So that's been going for over a year now. So in terms of sort of the pipeline of research into practice, a very close working from the start, and the nature of the work is quite different to usual. Often what we do is we try and get access, we take the data out, we take a few years, we give them a report back with some recommendations, and then we leave. And we knew that wouldn't work. So we stuck around and we tested solutions, although quite as rigorously as I would have maybe liked. But nonetheless, that's how it worked. So what I wanted to share with you from that is maybe not the theoretical framework. Maybe, no, I will share very broadly. Just to give you a sense of what the theory behind it is. So we had 6 pillars which turned into work packages. And this is basically Betsy and my reading of the literature on sexual violence, which is developed quite separately from the literature on policing, because policing researchers, just like policing itself, has a bit of a blind spot around sexual violence, theories of policing, theories of whether that's intelligence-led policing, hotspot policing, all of those things where academics have been involved have tended to focus on public spaces. There are very few exceptions to this. But so we use the policing literature, but also the feminist literature on sexual violence, because it's feminists who've produced most of that work. And we systemize this. The first one is, so the first 3 are basically the workhorses of day-to-day police work. The first one is investigations. The existing research tells us that the victim tends to be the first and sometimes the only site of investigation. Is the credibility of the victim. If you gave it as an example of a date night out, it would be following her through the night. How much did you drink? What did you do after? It's not following him through the night. How many bars were you before looking for somebody who looked drunk enough? It was sort of where the focus lies. And then the research within Operation Soteria, and Pillar 1 was led by Miranda Hohl, found when looking through case files that often suspects weren't interviewed at all or really late. That there was, and then in my own work in the pilot, found that police would collect vast amounts of evidentiary material on the credibility of the victim, their medical notes, their counselling notes, their phones, having not even spoken to the suspect yet or done a basic check of the suspect whether someone else had named them before. So Pillar 1 was about, rather than officers riding on myths and stereotypes and focusing on the victim as the primary side of the investigation, is begin the investigation where the offending begins, with the perpetrator, and how, as you would in other investigations in other areas, there is approved professional practice for policing, and it defines an investigation as the collection of evidentiary material pointing to or away from the suspect. There is no mention of the victim. A huge surprise to any sexual violence victim whose experience is that they're the primary site. And to do so, it's not sufficient to say, don't use rape myths and stereotypes, because police have been told that for decades and it doesn't work. You need to replace it with an understanding of how sexual offending behaviour happens, so you can collect evidentiary material that shows the lead up, and also maybe what the suspect or perpetrator might have done after to try and silence or reframe what happened, so the victim would ideally never go to the police and tell anyone because they think what happened wasn't really rape or they were to blame. So that was around change in investigations. The second is the most closely related to today's topic, which is to say, in 9 out of 10 rape and serious sexual offence cases, the suspect is named. So it's not the same problem as with other crimes, where one of the tasks is the whodunit. The whodunit is clear. If we started with the known perpetrators, what could be done to disrupt them, to stop them from doing it again? So at present, I'll actually come back to this one because I have more of that as that. So that was the second task, is to make that an explicit task. What police say their mission is anyway, disrupting, actually what are you doing? And our research showed they were doing next to nothing. The third is about how to engage with victim survivors. 6 out of 10 victims are marked as having withdrawn from the investigation, so they may have reported it but decided not to carry on. And as we've seen from the survey, for many victims, the process is pretty damaging. So this was to use some principles around engaging with victims. And we know a lot about what victims want and need from the feminist research, but clearly that wasn't a language policing was understanding. But procedural justice theory is a language police understands in other contexts. So, and it's something also I happen to have done a lot of work on before. So try and use that as the Trojan horse to get some of what we know from working with survivors into how policing work with people anyway, because at the end of the day, it's working with humans, and there is a lot of that. So that was the sort of day-to-day. And then the other pillars were in recognition that if we want police to do something differently, they need to be enabled to do so. So the other three focus on the 3 key resources in policing. One is people, the other one is data, and the third is forensic technologies. So that's sort of the framework. This is maybe for today just to locate where the reducing sexual violence might come in. So it come in by the standard route of prosecution. So if you do a more successful investigation, more likely you stop them through the classic criminal justice. The second is disruption tools, which I'll speak more about. And the third is to engage with victim survivors, so there might be a chance that they'll report to you again, because unless victims tell you, you will not find out about it. There's not much you can do. So policing totally relies on cooperation from the public. So these are sort of the main ones. Right. Now a glimpse into the as-is of policing prevention work. The first is that it's probably fair to say that sexual violence prevention is doubly marginalised in policing. Prevention work in itself has low status, little resource, little strategies attached to it. You find the odd academic experiment that might have been locally adapted, but by and large, prevention is not a big part of policing. It's typically reactive. Sexual violence prevention is the absolute Cinderella service, to borrow a word from Rob Reiner. It basically isn't done. And when we went into forces, it's like, who do we speak to about prevention? You'd need two people who were also responsible for monitoring all the sex offenders in their police force area, because sex offender management, 98% of registered sex offenders are managed by the police, and the police alone. The point where probation is involved is very brief. The second is a very poor understanding of sexual offending in general, but repeat offending specifically. So if you don't understand the patterns of offending from the literature and you don't look at it in your own data, you're flying blind. Now, when a survivor reports to the police, they very sadly have become an absolute expert in their perpetrator's sexual offending behaviour. They'll be able to tell you everything about the lead up, what they did then and what they did after. And that report, when made to the police, becomes police intelligence. It goes onto their police system. Policing is incredibly bad at using the information they already have. Police systems are bureaucratic systems designed for record keeping, not for analytic purposes. So we found that police wouldn't routinely use their own data to join the dots. And when you see these terrible cases making the headlines, the number of times you read, this person has been known to the police X many times before, it is no surprise once you see the system they're working with. We also found in the research, and that was Kari Davis leading that bit, that they wouldn't even routinely run a name check. So when somebody comes in and names a person, they wouldn't necessarily check them. Or if they check for when they've been convicted. But if convictions is a handful out of all cases, you're searching the rock pools and ignoring the ocean, because convicted sex offenders are such a small proportion of all sex offenders. So they're not routinely checking for it. They also have very limited analytical capability of somebody systematically working through the data and identifying those repeat perpetrators. One of the sort of near universal findings in criminology is that a relatively small number of offenders are accounting for large numbers of crime, whether that is burglary or anything else. And there's lots of reasons to think through the theories of why sexual violence happens that this is no different. It's not being used. Others are the focus on life danger cases where there is somebody on the loose right now. In sexual violence, that's rarely the case because for lots of reasons, survivors tend to take a bit of time to think about whether they want to tell the police. So it's not a life case, it's not a priority. There's a focus on a case at a time rather than looking at patterns. So you'll be missing those repeat perpetrators. You could maybe try and stop and intervene and therefore reduce sexual violence because they wouldn't carry on further. And the last one is the general responsibilization of women for preventing sexual violence. In routine activities, you would call it target hardening. So this is something we see in society more general, and you see it in police approaches as well. The question is not, what can we do to stop perpetrators? But the question is, what can victims do? So the advice is to women, watch your drink, don't leave your drink unattended. Why is it not? Don't put drugs in people's drinks. The advice is for women to be careful not walking alone in the dark. Why is the advice not? Leave them alone. So this is a poster from Rape Crisis. And it's an idea about shifting the focus. Where do we look? Who is responsible for sexual violence? And who is responsible for preventing it? There have been some very unfortunate advertising campaigns from some police forces saying, don't be the next one, with sort of mini cabs, and don't get into an unlicensed mini cab. How about police tackle the unlicensed mini cab who are abusing their position of access and trust at the end of the night? The other issue with responsibilizing victims is if you don't mention the perpetrators, you're creating this murky image, and then we might be back to the stranger danger, or in the States in the 80s, it was a lot about the black rapist. If you don't look at who the perpetrators actually are, you're leaving a lot of room for myths and stereotypes. Right, ways forward. So what were some of the solutions we designed with policing and they're trying now? The first one is, if you mess up individual cases, you're not building a good basis for sexual violence prevention going forward. So it's improved the quality of your investigations, and you will improve it if it's based on an evidence-based understanding of sexual offending behaviour patterns and looking for evidence that shows that, rather than the red herring of victim credibility that will lead you nowhere. The second is to understand repeat offending, serial offending, crossover offending. There is this idea that sex offenders are somehow specialists and they do sexually offend, or even only, and they don't do other types of crime, or even within that it's driven by sexual preference. The evidence is actually showing it's not. So in our research, again led by Kari Davies, they found, looking at policing's own data, less than half of perpetrators had never come to police attention before. Most were previously named. And in 25 to 50%, depending on police force, they were previously named for sexual offence. You have to understand your patterns of offending, and don't also get sidetracked into trajectories of offending where people start maybe with exposure and then they graduate to full-on rape. They tend to do many of those things at the same time, and there's also overlap with other forms of violence against women and girls. That absolutely is helped by using data and analytics. It should be the lifeblood of policing intelligence. And if you watch crime dramas, it seems to be, it's all about finding intelligence, information, putting it together. In practice, it's not done. And then the fourth is, when we looked, actually, there are incredibly powerful legal tools available to the police already, so-called civil orders. They can be applied when there have been no conviction at all, or when you're still in a process. They can be very far-reaching. So they can be applied for by the police, the magistrates' court have to sign them off. But you can use them to, for example, I mean, some have been done ridiculously, where somebody has to notify 24 hours before they're going to have sex with someone, so the police have a chance to talk to that person and say, actually, did you know? This one you can debate how clever that is or not. But there are others about British Transport Police, for example, used it where the MO of the person was they would sit opposite a lone female, they'd already be exposed with a coat over them. They're no longer allowed to place themselves opposite or near a lone female in any public space. If they violate that, that is a criminal offence. You can go to court for to prison for that. So there's lots of civil orders. They were introduced more than 10 years ago. I have not been able to find a single study that's evaluated their effectiveness, how they impact on perpetrators, on victims, whether they work. There is this tendency to create laws and then not check how they actually function. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and it hasn't been looked at. So that was one of them. Sex offender management. If 98% of sex offenders are solely managed by the police, and you have a very small unit with no resource, how is that possibly going to work? Another is there actually is quite a bit of research on assistance and prevention of interpersonal violence, maybe not as much on sexual violence, but there is some of it coming from here, some of it coming from the late David Farrington, should probably acknowledge today. Is it used? No. How do we get it in? How do we get that research into police practice? And then the final one is, in many other areas, we've begun to accept that just because we declare something a problem for policing and criminal justice, it doesn't mean that that's either the source or the solution of the problem. The war on drugs is a case in point. At some point, we decided this was a very unsightly problem. Let's pass it to the police and the criminal justice system to deal with it. We criminalize it and we pass the responsibility on to the police. Does it work? Not necessarily. And I think policing themselves is beginning to say we need to be doing things in context with other parts of society. Simply criminalizing things isn't going to help you solve it, because it's not what creates the problem. It's not what's going to solve it. Right. Two sets of reflections. The first is on Operation Soterian. At some point in this lecture, which might now feel a long time ago, I talked about sexual violence being an afterthought of policing. It's not what it's designed to do. The core of policing hasn't changed. It's been bolted on as a requirement now without changing the mechanism of policing to make it suitable for this type of crime. For sure, the times where policing have been able to get away with it are over. For the first time, typically public confidence in the police is barely dented by what's in the newspapers. I've done a big piece of research on this 10 years ago, and other people have since and before and after that shows this. But the one thing that changed it was the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer. It is the first time that more people say they don't trust the police than people say they do trust, and it never recovered. It's the first time we've seen the lines cross, and they have never crossed back. So in the public's mind, and this isn't just women, this is men too, how police respond to sexual violence is bound up with how we think about the police more widely. So police cannot afford to see that as a side issue. It's become more of a litmus test for public trust in the police. And I think that has surprised policing more than almost maybe a lot. Operation Soteria in policing and within the victim support sector is sort of a beacon of hope in that I think it's made some people think the impossible might be just a bit possible. When we started, the charge rate was below 2%, it's 6 or 7%. We don't know whether it's because of Soteria. There's no evaluation that could show us that. There is feedback from the sector and from policing. I say this is working, so they feel it's a model that can work. I think it's given some officers a sense that you can change big things. So even topics that feel too knotty, too wicked, too difficult to address, is you can make a way out of it. And the way you get out of it is not by keeping it within policing, it's by opening yourself up to research and evidence and almost taking the politicization out of it and looking for evidence-based ways to adjust. Now, the big question, can police reduce sexual violence? I feel I've done nothing to convince you that they can, but what I would say is, if policing is to do it, it requires a resetting of the default ways in which police works. We can't focus on safer streets and public spaces alone, because probably the reduction in sexual violence, perhaps wider interpersonal violence, that space is one thing. It's very different behind closed doors in domestic spaces, in spaces where people abuse positions of trust and power behind closed doors. That's required. The second is a plea for more police academic collaborations that are deep, long-term collaborations, not going in, taking data, writing a report, here are some recommendations, go figure, but doing the hard work of translating it into solutions. I think we also have been a bit thin, and this is a charge that I would probably lay on the feet of us as academics, is researching perpetrators of sexual violence is something we have stopped doing largely. There was quite a lot of research in the 70s, 80s and early 90s. You find little since. Nobody wants to work with perpetrators, but unless we understand how sexual offending works, we will have little hope of changing it. And just declaring it a police or criminal justice problem doesn't mean that that will produce a solution. And the final one is about the symbolic power and functions of the police. So whether or not police can actually reduce sexual violence, every individual they come in contact with is marked by what they do. Victim survivors, they're impacted. Because police are representatives of the state and the law, we see them as arbiters of right and wrong. How police position themselves, we as a leaders topic, has a signal value to the individuals, but also to wider. Also impacts on perpetrators. There's quite a bit of research to show that perpetrators are emboldened when they come to the attention of policing and then nothing happens, because they now know. Before that, they might have feared that maybe they get caught, maybe it's a problem. Now they can see, actually, it's fine. And the number of survivors in the survey who say the perpetrator laughed in their face afterwards, said, see, I told you no one will believe you. And it is remarkable. So police interventions going wrong is an issue. So it's the symbolic power of what it signifies, how police positions themselves collectively and individually, is one to think about whether or not they can actually get sexual violence down, and the function of the police. Who does it serve to responsibilise policing and criminal justice for sexual violence? We have this tendency of wanting to remove coercive powers from society and give it to the police to deal with, but does it serve us in the long run? Right, and this is the right hand, and thank you for your...
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katrin, for such an interesting and illuminating talk. I don't know if any of you have yet read her book, Policing Rape, but I strongly recommend it. It's a very clear and interesting read, and provokes a lot of thinking about how the police and the criminal justice system as a whole in this country has largely failed to achieve justice for the victims, survivors of rape. But it also offers some practical approaches for addressing the issue. And I think this is a really valuable illustration of how academia and the world of practice and policy can work together to achieve something really tangible in terms of change. I'm not going to speak for as long as Katrin, she was the main speaker, so I'm just going to add a couple of additional thoughts that have come from my own work with young people, and also looking at processes of change in assistance. And the first question that I put up here is in relation to the experiences that girls have of sexual violence. So if we switch the phrase around and say violence against girls and women, how does that change the lens with which we view these harms? And I think that there are particular reasons why it makes sense to think specifically about the experiences of girls. One is that adolescence is a time of uncertainty in relation to sexuality, and that can play into people's experiences of relationships and insecurities or uncertainties about the ways in which those relationships play out. And I think that's recognizing those uncertainties during this period of adolescence is important. A second point is that for many young people, the world of the internet has become a place which is also harmful, where sexual violence can be amplified and prolonged, and that this is particularly an issue for young people and something that we need to think about. Then when we think about issues to do with disclosing harm, disclosing sexual violence, it may be even more of an issue for someone who maybe feels that there is some stigma attached to what they've been doing, that their family and their familial culture and values are something that they will be contradicting if they go forward and disclose what has happened to them. So that additional pressure of being part of a family where family norms may be constraining may well play into the experiences of disclosure. Another issue relates to whether girls' voices are heard as victims, and the Rotherham inquiry here was an illustration of where girls' voices were simply not heard when they reported sexual violence. They were seen as troublemakers, as girls who were in places where they shouldn't have been. Those of you who are familiar with Niels Christie's framework of the ideal victim will recognise that society tends not to see victims in people who have been in the wrong places doing disrespectful activities and so on. So these are girls who were coming forward explaining that they were experiencing harm and being disbelieved, being thought that they were consenting to sexual relations from the age of 11 years onward. So there are questions then about who we listen to, how voices are recognised. And with girls too, and interestingly, the age threshold for support varies. So if you go online and look for support from Rape Crisis, they will say they offer support for people aged 16 and over. If you are under 16, you need to look to find another phone number, Childline, but it is not always clear where you will go and what will happen to you. And I think these questions about thresholds are important. I was talking to Katrin about them just before the talk, and she was saying that the average ages of people who are victims, survivors of sexual violence, and those who are perpetrators of sexual violence has come below the age of consent. So this is an issue that is a growing issue, one that we need to ask, are the police the right place to deal with these issues of sexual harm? And then finally, in relation to the experiences of girls, is the question of safe spaces. Where can you go? Where can you go and be totally open about what's happened to you? Where can you talk about the experiences and how a situation developed? Where can you feel safe? If you go to some of the support agencies, there is a little rider which says, if you disclose anything that is likely to cause harm to you or to someone else, we will pass that on. This idea that there is a welfare dimension to passing on to the police, passing on to social services, information that might have been just expressed as a means of unloading and explaining what has happened, is problematic if we feel that these may generate spaces which are not safe for people and for girls to go forward and sort of unload about their experiences. So just some further thoughts about girls and the ways in which we might engage and support girls who have been victim survivors of sexual violence. The other thing I want to do is, as Katrin has also highlighted, police are one agency within society. The quote at the top was made a couple of days ago by Gisèle Pellicot. Some of you may be familiar with the rape trial that is currently going on in France. And what she has alluded to here, what I think is important for us all to recognise, is that it's not just what's happening within policing, but it is also what's going on within society, the values that are perpetrated within society, the toleration of values that are misogynistic in many different ways. And I'm not going to go through the different levels, but I put these up here to illustrate that there are multiple ways in which we need to engage with this issue. But two observations I want to draw from research that I've been involved with looking at desistance relates to two projects. One is looking at the role of the arts in evoking value change. So at the individual level, what is it that will lead someone to reflect on what they've done in the past and prompt some thinking about how to change in the future? And these are two quotes from a drama programme which we evaluated as part of a wider evaluation of the arts and criminal justice settings, Inspiring Futures. And these were men who were in prison, who had committed offences, and were reflecting on the worlds that they had been a part of and the worlds that they wanted to become in the future. And the first one is a diary extract from a man who talked about seeing a role play of a fictional character who was acting out with a lot of violence, and seeing himself in that character and recognising how others must have felt when they saw him acting violently. And that, he said, was hard, but also therapeutic in a way of helping him to sort of think about how he might move forward. The second quote is about empowerment, of how art and drama, in this case, through role play, can support people in developing confidence to stand up to others, to speak on the phone what they really wanted to say but have never been able to say before. So we see the power of these arts interventions playing out at an individual level. But we also see, and this is my final slide, change happening through the everyday activities of our lives. This is an extract from a chapter that I supported Tony Bottoms in writing. Tony Bottoms was one of the lead researchers of the Sheffield Assistance Study, and we analysed the narratives of men who were desisting from crime and making changes in their lives. And what we saw, and what is captured here by the quote of Cheryl Massingley, is that recognition is important, but actually change happens through the ordinary everyday interactions of daily life, through the relationships, through the activities that people get involved in, whether that's looking after children, caring for elderly people, just looking out for somebody else. And it's through those tiny interactions that change can occur. And so drawing this back to thinking, my final point, about the values that we see within society, but also the values that we have seen identified within police culture, those that need to change, those misogynistic values that have been shown to be prevalent within some parts of the police forcing, that we should also, as well as thinking about policies, as well as thinking about targets, which are important, we should also be looking at the everyday small interactions that take place, the little conversations, the jokes, the banter, the interactions, the routines that people play and take part in within police stations and police forces, and just see what the values are that are being played out there, and think about whether change at that level will make a difference too. Thank you.